Hey guys, Paul Warburg coming to you back from a random forest in Utah today. Today let's talk about a very important topic. Russian nukes. How much of a threat are they? And what are the chances that Russia actually could and would use them to target a European or American city? Now, if you're somebody who has been closely following the war in Ukraine, and honestly, even if you're somebody who has barely been following the war in Ukraine, or not even at all, you're probably very familiar with the fact that Russia has been making a lot of nuclear threats lately. A lot more than most people realize. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, they have made over 40 different nuclear threats, threatening the world with basically nuclear annihilation if they take certain steps to help Ukraine. Russia has famously set a huge number of nuclear red lines, telling the West not to support Ukraine in certain ways, or else. And what I want to talk about in this video is very important, to examine the actual possible veracity of those threats and the degree to which we should actually take them seriously. Now, throughout this video, I am going to be bringing some facts and data to mind, some of which are easily verifiable, some of which we could never be able to verify, but which are very highly logically consistent, to hopefully nerf Russian nukes in your own mind, and therefore remove the threat and the anxiety of Russian nuclear weapons from the equation. But before I do that, it bears noting something right from the beginning. For any country that owns nuclear weapons, there is a lot to be gained from threatening to use them, and very little to be gained from actually using them. And this actually goes back to the very idea of nuclear doctrine itself, even among countries like the US, which have actually used nuclear weapons in the past. The whole point of a nuclear weapon is that you have a weapon that is so deadly and so terrifying that you can prevent your opponent from taking conventional military actions against you that could threaten you. And this is how nuclear weapons were used even by the United States in World War II. Yes, the United States did actually nuke 2 Japanese cities, but they did not nuke all of Japan. They nuked Japan as little as they possibly could to get the point across, to get Japan to then conventionally give them what they wanted. It was not actually nuclear weapons that forced Japan to end the war, if you really think about it, but it was the threat of further and further use of nuclear weapons. Now, following their victory in World War II, the United States found themselves in several different armed conflicts during a period of history where they were the only people on Earth with nuclear weapons. And they did not decide to use nuclear weapons under those circumstances. And the question you have to ask is why? And if you can answer that question, that helps you understand also why Russia, in the modern day, is unlikely to use nukes over the war in Ukraine. What it boils down to is that while nuclear weapons have immense power as a deterrent, their value drastically diminishes the moment that you actually start to use them en masse. This was true even for the United States when they were the only nuclear power on Earth, and they could have theoretically destroyed anybody they wanted and conquered anybody they wanted with no chance of military retaliation. Even under those circumstances where the US would have had a guaranteed military victory, the backlash against the United States, not to mention their own moral compass, would have made that decision impossible to actually achieve an outcome that was worth doing the action. As more and more countries began to get the bomb, using the bomb wouldn't just destroy any economic value that you could get by bombing people, and it wouldn't just destroy your moral standing in the world, it would actually destroy your physical life. As the Soviet Union got more and more nuclear missiles, them and the US started amassing huge stockpiles, and something came into being that was called mutually assured destruction, which was basically, if anybody ever used a nuclear missile, the other side would retaliate with such force that their entire country and the entire world would be destroyed. And under these circumstances, though people amassed huge amounts of deadly weapons, there was never a valid psychological motivation for anybody, not even the world's most despotic dictators, to actually launch a nuke. Now, under these circumstances, even while you could very validly argue that the actual power of a nuclear weapon in terms of explosions became less and less valid, the fear that was generated by nuclear weapons went up and up and up and up. And people began to realize that, and they began to use that fear as the weapon itself. And nobody was more adept at this than the Soviet Union. On paper, the Soviet Union amassed a huge nuclear arsenal, the size of which we'll probably never truly actually know. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of information came to light that the Soviet Union actually didn't have nearly the capacity that they claimed to have. There were people who were in charge of Soviet nuclear parades who said that we didn't actually have all those missiles that we paraded. We just had enough to keep going around the block over and over and over and over again with things that were actually dummy missiles and not real nuclear warheads. Nobody could actually go up to the warheads in a giant parade of missiles and knock on them and blow them up just to check and make sure that they were actually working. And the Soviet Union realized that this was a very potent tool. By threatening the United States constantly with a growing nuclear arsenal, they could do two things. They could prevent the United States from taking as strong of military action as they could in fear of a nuclear retaliation. And second, they could trick the United States into wasting money on military capabilities designed to counter Soviet missiles. Now, that's not to say the Soviet Union did not have real nukes. That's not what I'm claiming. The claim is that we see from a lot of sources that came out of the Soviet Union that the actual level of capability was drastically over-exaggerated. So as the Cold War progressed, the Soviet Union started to view nuclear missiles and nuclear weapons more as a propaganda tool than as an actual weapon. And the best example of this is probably the Tsar Bomba, famously the largest explosion in human history. Now, I forget the actual precise stat, and I don't have internet right here to confirm it exactly, but the Tsar Bomba was something like a multitude of 1,000 times, well over 1,000 times larger than the explosions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the problem with the Tsar Bomba was that while it generated a huge amount of fear, in fact, they were so afraid when they detonated it that it could crack the earth or do some crazy things that were unanticipated, that they dropped the payload in half. While it was this big and this scary, it was a completely impractical weapon. It was far too heavy to ever be mounted on a nuclear warhead, which means to drop it on your opponent, you would have to load it onto an airplane and fly it to enemy territory, crossing over a lot of major Soviet cities on the way. More than likely, that airplane would get shot down before it ever reached its target, and in a practical sense, it was actually more of a threat to the Soviets than it was to the Americans or to the Europeans. And yet for the Soviets, it was a massive propaganda victory, because it ensured that everybody was afraid. Now, modern Russia has not forgotten the propaganda value of things like the Tsar Bomba. So much so that actually, when Russia was preparing to invade Ukraine, they ensured to release never-before-seen footage of the Tsar Bomba just to remind everybody of the destructive potential of nuclear weapons, even though, again, it's a completely impractical weapon. Russia wanted people, as they were invading Ukraine, to be terrified of what Russia's nuclear retaliation could do to them if they tried to stop Russia. And that has become a major part of their strategy, and that is why they have threatened nuclear warfare over 40 different times. But notably, they have threatened it over 40 times and delivered on it exactly 0 times. So now let's look at some data on Russia's nuclear arsenal and ask ourselves the very important question. Could Russia even nuke anybody if they wanted to? And the answer to that is technically, probably yes, but practically, actually probably no. The Russian nuclear arsenal has changed quite drastically since the collapse of the Soviet Union. In fact, a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the Soviet Union's nukes were never stationed in Russia in the first place. Ukraine in particular had a huge portion of them that they negotiated to give to Russia in exchange for security guarantees. Gee, that really worked out great. That's why you need your nuclear deterrent. But a lot of Russian nukes, or rather Soviet nukes, were lost in the collapse. In Kazakhstan, for example, there were famous examples of civilians selling uranium out of buckets, out of open buckets. This radioactive material that was extremely deadly and extremely valuable. And the United States had a huge effort to try to collect all of that and ensure that it didn't get into the wrong hands. And a lot of people have noted that since the Soviet Union collapsed, there has been not nearly enough investment in Russian nuclear capabilities to actually maintain the arsenal that they say they have. On paper, Russia has 5,600 nuclear warheads, which makes them the largest nuclear power in the Earth, even beating the United States, which only has about 5,000 nuclear warheads. Similar number, but considerably less. However, there is a massive problem with that. For the United States, where data is a lot more public, it is known that the US spent in the year 2021 approximately $50 billion just maintaining its 5,000 nuclear warheads. A huge sum. Now, in comparison, in that same year, just before Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia spent $60 billion on their entire military, including their arsenal of 5,600 nuclear warheads, which is more than the US arsenal, but also including the Russian Navy, the Russian Air Force, Russian infantry, ground troops, even simple things like meals and uniforms. All those costs add up. So the United States spends just on its nuclear arsenal about the same amount as Russia was spending on its entire military. Now for Russia, there's an even further problem with all of this, which is that as the whole world saw the following year when Russia invaded Ukraine, a huge chunk of the money that was allocated to military spending wasn't actually spent on the military, but was instead stolen. As we saw when Russia invaded Ukraine, there were massive quantities of straight up fake equipment. There were things that were supposed to be explosives that were actually filled with blocks of wood. There was what was supposed to be explosive protective armor on tanks that was filled with things like rubber or sand. There were entire fleets of trucks where they were basically stripped of things like copper, and they were replacing expensive, high-quality military tires with cheap knockoffs that would go flat very quickly. There were Kevlar vests that were not Kevlar vests, so they weren't bulletproof like they were supposed to be, and on and on and on the examples go. And pretty much every category of Russian military hardware that we saw in action, we saw big portions of that had been stolen rather than actually being spent appropriately. And it would actually boggle the mind to assume that the same thing didn't also apply to Russian nukes. The reason that so many Russian military officers were so willing to do graft and steal things rather than actually spending the money isn't just because they love money, but because they thought they would never get caught. And the reason they thought they would never get caught is because they assumed that Russia would never actually go into an active hot war. A lot of people thought that was a thing of the past. And if that applies to regular military hardware, it definitely applies to nuclear weapons, which have a long history, especially in the Soviet sphere, of being used primarily as a deterrent to scare people, and where even in the Soviet era there were reports of the supposed nuclear weapons actually being fakes. Now, notably, to support this, not only are the odds of Russia actually using a nuke against a military target infinitesimally small, but Russia also doesn't even test nukes anymore. which would make them a very, very high-profile target for graft, because the chances of somebody finding out that you stole the money are so small, because nobody's ever going to actually go and test the thing and realize, oh crud, this doesn't work. Now, none of this is to say that Russia does not have any functioning nukes. They probably have quite a few. But the problem is that they probably don't know which ones actually work, and they don't know how many actually work. And from a practical standpoint, that means that nuclear weapons are almost certainly not a real tactical option for Russia. The reason for this plays into a response that I give to an objection I often get here, which is that, well, who cares if a lot of Russia's nukes don't work? They only need a couple of them to work to create a really, really bad day. It only takes one nuke to destroy New York City, or Washington, D.C., or London, or Berlin. It's just not worth the risk. And of course you understand why people feel that way, because technically speaking, that's true. But from a tactical standpoint, it actually makes nuclear missiles impossible to use. And it goes back to the massive stockpiles that the United States and the Soviet Union built up during the Cold War. Why did they build up stockpiles so big? Because they knew that if they ever used a nuke, they better use a whole lot of them. They better try to completely wipe out their opponent before they have time to retaliate. Because when your opponents also have nuclear missiles, that is the only possible positive outcome for you. And even then, the chances of that outcome happening are very, very small, almost impossible. Basically, if you launch nukes, you're going to get destroyed. Now, under those circumstances of mutually assured destruction, nobody launched nukes because the risk wasn't worth it. So now if you think about that from the modern Russian standpoint, where they wouldn't even have mutually assured destruction, all they would have is, hey, we're going to destroy a few cities, and in return, we get completely destroyed. The math just doesn't math. Now, critically, this is true both for countries with good leaders and for bad leaders. Because every leader, and arguably, especially bad leaders, have the same motivation, which is a motivation for self-preservation. You have to realize that a dictator is a dictator because they love power and they love money, and they love living large. Nobody becomes a dictator because they want to sacrifice, because they want to make sacrifices. And so a dictator has every motivation to preserve their own life, and therefore is extremely unlikely to ever launch a nuclear missile, except for ideological reasons. Even when it comes to Vladimir Putin, even if you make the assumption that somebody like this could just be backed into a corner and figure, I'm going out anyways, I'm going to, out of pride or out of anger or retaliation, just take out other people with me. Even that scenario does not work currently today. Because even in Russia, they have nuclear fail-safes. Vladimir Putin cannot go today and just decide to launch Russia's nuclear missiles. To launch Russia's nuclear missiles, it requires the authorization of 3 different people. Now, technically, Vladimir Putin could probably coerce those other people and force them to give the authorization. But this is the least leverage he ever has when it comes to forcing people to do something. And this is where these people, even if they give in to every single coercive action that Vladimir Putin takes against them, they're likely to resist this one, because this one results in their death. And so the risks of opposing Putin actually become lower than the risks of listening to him. So it's very unlikely that this authorization would ever be given unless these 3 separate people, all at the exact same moment, decided that they wanted to go out with a bang rather than trying to enjoy whatever was left of the wealth and power they had for the rest of their lives. That is never going to happen. And this is just giving the authorization to launch the nukes. It's not actually the action of the nukes being launched. And that creates a conundrum too. When you look at the history of the Cold War, there was at least 1 and possibly 2 different circumstances where the order was actually given, or was perceived to have been given, to launch nukes. One was due to a well-known technical failure in a Russian submarine where they lost communication and the doctrine said they were supposed to launch their nukes. The Russian subcommander refused to do it. There was enough doubt in his mind, there was enough fear of world annihilation that this one man decided he wasn't going to launch his nuclear missiles, and he basically saved the world. There is another circumstance which isn't confirmed, but there's a lot of evidence and credence for it, where a rogue US subcommander who really hated the Soviets tried to create the circumstances to create a false signal so that his crew would be forced to launch their missiles. And his crew didn't listen to that either. They questioned the signal and they refused the order. Whether only one of those or both of those is true, the point is that even if a despotic dictator decides, hey, we're going to give the order to launch nukes, it still comes down to the guy on the ground who actually makes it happen. The guy who probably has a wife and kids at home. And so it's very unlikely that even if that dictator is going to be willing to sacrifice everything, that he's going to be willing to do so as well. All of that said, there is a massive threat when it comes to nuclear red lines. And I am going to argue that the threat of when a dictator gives you a nuclear red line, the threat is not crossing the red line. The threat is not crossing the red line. And that's for several different reasons. But primarily, it is because of the message that it sends to other nations. When you cower down, when you back down from taking an action because somebody threatened to nuke you, in this specific instance, when you do not support Ukraine the way that you otherwise might want to do because Russia threatened to nuke you, what you communicate to every dictator in the world is that, hey, if I get my hands on nuclear weapons, I can get away with a lot of cool stuff that I really want to get away with. I can take over territory, I can build wealth, I can do everything I want to do. And the huge risk in that is that when these dictators get their hands on nuclear weapons, they might not have the fail-safes that Russia has, where you actually do need 3 different people to authorize it to make it happen. The leaders of these countries might be religiously radicalized. They might be radicalized for any number of reasons. And they might say, we're going to build nuclear weapons, and I alone am going to have the authorization to fire them. And so you actually create a much more dangerous world in the long term by not crossing nuclear red lines than you do by crossing them, at least in situations like Ukraine, where the red lines are so clearly ridiculous that a nuclear retaliation would just not be on the table. With that in mind, if you guys enjoyed this discussion, if you thought this information was important, if I could ask for a quick favor, would you subscribe to this channel, like this video, and if you want to support further videos like this, would you consider becoming a patron? Patrons are awesome. I am super thankful for all of you. Your support has allowed me to begin hiring video editors to help me with these videos, which means I can spend more of my time on research and communication and get more important topics to more people's ears. So if you want to support this channel and the work that I'm doing here, you can scan the QR code on screen or visit the link in the description of this video. That's all for today, guys. I'll see you on the next one.